Now the one thing that we can see immediately is that this slider, this switch, is of course a blend slider. So it is of course possible, if I say advance to a frame here, find some other pose, and at this point I'll blend it off to IK, and so we wind up with an IK-FK blend taking place across several frames here. We can see that it works out fine. We don't have any nasty behaviour going on in between the two systems. They do blend into one another just fine. So you do have the option to switch IK on a single frame or to blend between frames like this, and you will still get a decent behaviour. Of course, the thing I've never liked about blending is what happens when you're at, partial blend, for instance here where I'm at 50%. I can still use my FK, but it's a little twitchy in between there, and I can still sort of use my IK, but that's really kind of twitchy. So of course smoothing out any in-betweens in that section where the limb is half controlled by IK and FK can be a problem. So that means if you've got a good interpolation going on between an IK-FK blend, no problem, but trying to tween it in between can always be an issue. When it comes to this blending and switching, it's not just the IK to FK that is so set up, we've also got our twist options set up that way. So here for the minute I'm using a character space twist controller, which is of course a child of the actual body hierarchy, so that's how that will hold in place. If I wanted to switch to world space or pole vector, as we can see when I'm twisting the limb, the pole vector is coming along with it. It is snapped. So at any point I want, I can key the pole vector, throw the pole on, and we see that once again it stays in place. And now manipulating my pole vector is giving me a world space twist, keeping the elbow pointed in that world space vector. Of course we'll notice this snaps back the other way. We can see that as I'm turning this, my character space twist controller is updating. So if I were to want to switch back to character space again, then I can key that controller, switch the pole off, and once again everything stays snapped in place, allowing me to switch back seamlessly. And the final option when we are in pole vector mode is this pole pin item, which is a child of the IK goal. We can key that, as it will follow along with the pole vector as the pole vector itself is moved, so we can key its position off, throw on the pole pin controller, and now the pole will be pinned to this item, which we can move around on its own, but which of course is also a child of our IK goal space, allowing us to link our limb twist into the IK goal in this fashion. And as we'll notice, everything back updates, so once again I can select my character space twist controller, key that, throw myself out of pole mode, and of course everything has stayed in place and I'm back to character space control. This control setup you won't often use that much on the arms. It will depend on the action of course, but it's much more useful on the legs. By having our pole pin option on the leg, then the knee will always orient to match the foot space, making that a very handy little feature. We'll come back to the legs and feet in a moment. I just want to finish off talking about the arms and shoulders first. What we have here are the clavicle controllers, which, as we can see, is just a simple pull up and down controller. It's kind of like IK, but it's not, it's really FK. And we notice that this works exactly the same for both the IK mode and the FK mode, giving us up and down and forwards and backwards motion of our clavicle bone. The other thing worth taking note of here on the clavicle controller is the rotation option. By twisting it on bank, our clavicle can be twisted around. Now in this pose it's really not helping us out much, but when you do get into very extreme poses, demonstrated here in the ever problematic hand behind the head pose, you can see that throwing a little bit of bank rotation onto our clavicle can really help to smooth things out and give us a much more natural result in this sort of extreme reach. Incidentally, this can also be a good opportunity for grabbing our shoulder offset here and actually manipulating the shoulder on translation to create a bit more spacing within our rig as necessary, just to get the shaping of it all just right. Going back to our legs and feet, the legs don't need much explanation, they function much the same as the arms do. But the feet have a wonderful little control system built into them, giving us an awful lot of the common animation we'll do on the foot from just one single null. We have the tip back and tip up on the front and rear pivot points of the foot there. we have the ankle raise and spinning out from the heel position. If we switch to rotation, we have spinning from the foot ball position, we have toe flapping, and we also have the side-to-side foot tipping. When extra channels are required, for instance if we're pivoted up on the heel here, we have a heel point null, which allows us to twist the foot from that point in that manner. And when we're up on tiptoe, we have a tiptoe control here, which allows us for either turning the foot around from the tiptoe point, or to roll it side to side in this fashion. The other handy little control that we have here is an exposed goal item for the ankle, which we can move around within the IK foot space, get manual control over the actual goal item itself, independently of these other controllers. It can help us create nice nuanced motion into our foot. Back and forth tipping on the foot here is also particularly handy in walk cycles. For instance, if we're coming down into the contact pose here, a few frames later we're up on the foot like this, and then a few frames after that we've come up onto the tiptoe. You can see by looking at the graph for this item, in the Y and Z channels here, we get this nice repeating line, which makes it very easy for us to retime the action of our foot and the overlap between the different actions that go on in a walk cycle. The other thing not to be forgotten in the whole leg system is this hip spinner null here, which works independently of the root and gives us our pivoting from the hip like this. So we have the option of either doing our tipping on the root item and then counter animating the spine, or keeping the spine steady and doing all of the hip tip and roll on a separate item itself. Again, allowing for an animator preference. This hip item can even be translated as a squash and stretch effect to smush and pull the hips around, again independently of the root and spine. To have a head float system in place, which when turned on will keep the head oriented to world space rather than character space. All axis, of course. Space can be set here from the headspace controller, turned in this fashion. Thing to note with the headspace control is that of course the neck is also part of it, so you're not having to animate your neck to catch up with what the head is doing. Thing to notice, however, that whilst twisting the neck side to side, rolling it over side to side, actually requires the neck to go in the same direction as the head, when the head is turning up and down, the neck is not so much. The neck is much more voluntary. You can tip the head up with the neck pitched up, or you can tip the head up with the neck pitched down. For this reason, you'll notice that the neck does not go up and down along with the head space, giving you manual FK control over that particular parameter. Once again, like the IK switching, this is snapped for us, so we can key off the FKs here, throw the head back into FK mode. Of course, the head is now in character space. And this is also double matched, so we can roll the head around this sort of a fashion to pose it, and you'll notice that our head space is updating with that. We can key that, put the head float back on, and once again we get a snapped match between the two. The other thing to remember with the head is that there's also an offset item at the end of it, and this offset item can be used to animate the head whether in the FK space or the head float space. It's additive on top of both systems. Can be really handy when you want to add a little bit of variation to the head, but more or less keep it in a world float space. Of course, as we've already seen, we have the eyes, have this local controller, which is basically FK, follows along with the head space. That can be switched out to this IK control, or look at control, simply by keying it off, bring the eyes into world space. There we have, of course, world space eyes. We will look at that control. Once again, this snaps back and forth both ways, so we can position this somewhere, off the local controller, switch it back, and we're once again returned to local space eyes, just like that. So let's move on and take a look at some of the other systems that we have in place across different characters, and we're going to take a look here at our little hand system that we have in place. Now, of course, you have your normal, FK movements on all your fingers. That's great. One thing I want to show you with the FK fingers is if you grab these first knuckle joints, you can create the cupping action that happens in a hand, the movement of the metacarpal, simply by translating these first joints, which is a nice handy little way to work. We also on some rigs have this controller here, which is our hand grip system. Basically what this does is, you rotate it and it creates a grip in your fingers like that, but it will also handle finger splaying, when operated on pitch, and it will also operate the finger twisting like this to get the fingers to twist in. This is a really cool system because it works with the FK. So what you can do, for instance, is you can have the hand pose like this in some fashion, but you can still grab these FK controllers and animate those additively on top of this thing, you see, allowing you to get more variation across the fingers in the hand, not have them completely uniform controlled by this one item. The other thing that we have in our advanced hand systems is IK-FK switching for the fingers, and so we do have fingertip IK available as well, where you have these goals at each finger for manipulating the fingers in IK mode, and there's a master controller here, which is the parent of all of the finger controls, that works in this fashion. These single finger controls for the IK allow you to, of course, pose your finger in this sort of a fashion, and rotating it like this will give you the curl at the last joint in the finger, and of course twisting it on bank like this will give you the fingertip, or the finger roll more correctly. Now the one thing that you do have to do is, if you are mixing up IK and FK on the fingers, is you do need to reset this master controller to 0, because it is additive, so even when your fingers are in IK mode, having this not set to 0 will cause your fingers to be offset from their IK goal positions. But you can still use the up-down motion that exists on this controller to create the cupping in the hand here, which is also very handy and plays perfectly well with the IK. The other thing that we have in the fingertip IK settings is we have this hand ball controller, which allows us, when the arm itself is in IK mode, to create roll from the hand ball point whilst keeping the fingers in their IK position. This can of course also be translated if desired. This is handy if you've got, fingertips in contact with a surface, and of course the wrist will often move around whilst the fingertips need to stay locked in place. So this whole system works out very nicely for doing little actions like that, allowing you to get very nice, subtle, nuanced movements in your hand. Now the thing to notice with the finger IK is how it behaves in respect of IK-FK switching. If you're in IK mode on your fingers and you want to switch back to FK mode, then that's not a problem. That is of course snapped. You just key off your FK goals, and when you switch the fingers back into FK, obviously that will remain behind. What you do not have is snapping going the other way. So if you pose your finger up in FK like this, you notice that the IK goal has not snapped along with, and so of course going back into IK from FK will blend the finger back and forth. The main reason for this is because every finger of course is its own independent IK chain, and setting up full snapping on all of them would have required an awful lot of extra cycles to be calculated for the hand rig, and it's a control that's not used that often, so snapping it up fully in such a way would have slowed the rig down an awful lot for a control that's used relatively little. That being the case, in such a situation, the best way to do it is to deal with a blend, and the best way to work out your blend is to find out where your IK and FK points are going to be. So let's say for instance that we are of course starting out on FK like this, and maybe our finger is rotated into something like this position, and then a few frames later we're going to have it come up in this sort of a fashion, reaching something like that sort of a pose there, and then it's going to jab forward maybe onto a surface and switch into IK. So what we do is we come out to our frame here where we want the IK contact to have occurred. I will at this point switch my fingers into IK, position that finger where I'm wanting it to be for the jab. Perhaps it's something like that, it's jabbed on to the IK position there, and what I will simply do is I will now grab my FK controllers and key them. Now jump to the frame before the IK hits, of course put my fingers back into full FK mode, and so what we now get is our fingers go in FK, 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 come to the point just before they bite, and boom, they've now switched into IK, but we've got a smooth blend going on between the two. It is a little fiddlier, but that fiddliness comes in exchange for the better rig performance, which of course when you're animating is something very important, having a rig that performs at a decent enough speed.